Good morning. I'm Taiyon Coleman, and I'm here with Mariama Diallo, Meredith Lippincott, and Mirren Gordon-Crozier. And Mariama is director and writer of the movie Master, which premiered in Prime Video this year, 2022, this month. And we're going to talk a little bit about the movie and about what it was like making it. I first just want to say thank you for the honor to be here and to talk with you. I'm normally just a teacher of writing and literature, so I don't often have the opportunity to talk with filmmakers, but the opportunities that I've had, I've just enjoyed. So this is another icing on the cake for me. As said earlier, please know that everyone can respond to any of the questions that I ask. They're open for everyone. I want to start though with Jasmine and a particular detail as a way to open the conversation. I noticed there is a scene where she's in the dorm room and you see her getting out of the bed and her socks are black and white stripes. And of course, part of the story is that there's a witch, the folklore connected to that dorm room. And it made me think of the wicked witch of the East from The Wizard of Oz, when the house hits her and when her shoes come off of her and her feet curl up, her socks are black and white. And Mariama, I saw you in an interview talking about just the wonderful work of bringing your crew together and working with your crew. And you talked about them so lovingly with such compassion and respect, and thinking about that detail and production. For me, among many details of the movie, I could say to myself, this is a person who had a crew and a body of people that paid close attention to every single detail. So I'd like to talk to you about the process of what was it like bringing the group together of people who worked with you to make this movie possible?
Yeah, totally. I love that as a first question, and I love that detail. And its relation to the film. I think that, one of the things that I was really fortunate to have benefited from is just amazing collaborators, two of whom are here today. And it is true that the depth of, of research and work and all consuming focus on the film was something that I felt in basically all of the different departments. And Meredith and I would have conversations about all of the, the details and minutia of, what it means to be the space of Ancaster. And Mirren and I would have long conversations about the characters and their interests and their likes. And it was really it was a long conversation that we all were having, with each other also in terms of furnishing the world and really, giving it texture and making it real. And it's something that was really important, I would say, from the outset. And I felt really good when people noticed stuff like that in the viewing. I remember somebody bringing up, they're like, damn, your costume designer. It was the smallest detail in a scene where Amelia, I think it's when Amelia, not to spoil anything, but she's walking away. And it's just her jeans. They're worn in. Her back pocket of her jeans are worn in around the shape of her phone, and they were just that, that level of sort of detail work and just really getting the world to feel lived in. And so it doesn't feel like your characters are wearing costumes or are on a set. That's something I think Meredith can talk to as well. When we would, especially in the early days when we were imagining the world of Ancaster, one of the things was, well, we don't want this to look like, the Clue, the board game. We really want this to feel authentic and lived in. And there's a version of the film where everything is just shiny and perfect. But then there's, the closer to reality version where it's more lived in. There's wear and tear. And so it was just a really fun, really cool process working with the crew.
I'm glad you talk about those details, because as a psychological thriller, I didn't know what to expect before watching the movie. I think I was ready for violence, but it wasn't violent in that way. But in some ways, by not having it be violence on that stereotypical level, it was often more violence. So toward the end of the movie, and again, spoiler alert, when Liv picks up her cloak, it's almost like I have to acknowledge, wow, I've seen that cloak throughout the entire movie. So in a way, I feel like you're having me kind of oscillate between wanting it to be a real experience, but are we in the moment of sci-fi or fantasy or fiction? Because I don't even want it to be that bad. But in some sense, it is that bad. And I know that in your shorts from my research of your work, that this is not the first time that you've talked about racism and structural racism. I want to talk about the courage of having a Black female protagonist almost kind of embodied between three characters, right? And to talk about the violence, which I would say is every day, right? Considering right now with the hearings with Judge Ketanji Brown, right?
Oh, yeah.
This is a reality for us, but the courage to say, no, I'm going to make it a horror film. Can you talk about why you felt such a need to do that and the courage to do it? Because oftentimes people look away from the institutional, and I would say normalized violence of Black females and PWIs, or in this culture.
Yeah, completely. You know, I think that some of it was, some of it just grew necessarily out of the story that I was trying to tell. And in trying to tell Gail's story and Jasmine's story and Liv's story, I had to confront institutional racism, because that was at the heart, in my opinion, of a lot of their experiences and a lot of the experience of being at a PWI. And so it just had to happen that way. And everything, once I opened that door to being like, I want to tell a story about, you know, primarily, you know, starting with Gail, about a Black woman who's been saddled in a lot of ways with this, you know, burden of being, you know, the first Black master. Everything else came rushing in. And as well, the horror of it as well, you know, it wasn't a stylistic decision for the film to be horror. It felt like very just true to the story and tonally very accurate for what the characters were going through. And so it was just something that I had to, once I challenged myself to tell that story, I had to go all the way, you know.
Yeah, and I agree. And in that way, I was pleasantly surprised, but also moved. So if that's what you were going to trying to achieve, maybe I can be a measure of that. Meredith and Mirren, if you feel comfortable, can you speak to how you tailored your work to also achieve that goal or work on those themes?
I guess, well, I'll go first, I guess. I think one of our main things with Gail was sort of having her in monochromatic, and initially we had more tweeds and things that maybe a traditional professor on the East Coast would wear. It sort of morphed into more of like always keeping up appearances, always having the scarf and the jacket and the shirt and the pant, everything, you know, perfect color wise.
Like,
you know,
armor.
obviously almost armor. And you know, she's got her perfect earrings and her necklace, and she's always, you know, on the mark. I mean, I think we use red as well in the beginning, sort of to show her entering like a new space, I would say, when she's entering the master house. But apart from that, she's generally like more muted and desaturated in a way. Perhaps to sort of not stand out too much, I guess. And I would say the same with Jasmine as well, where she is really sort of nondescript in a way, and doesn't have her funky style like Cressida, who's wearing her, you know, metallic pants and her red beret, and you know, and same goes with like Amelia and, you know, all the other girls. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, I think, because when you are of that age, either you can become a chameleon and emulate the girls that are in school or around you, or you kind of stick to your own thing. So we definitely talked about that a lot, right, Mariama? Yeah.
And like giving her sort of like a suburban sort of mall style that stands, you know, in sort of a contrast to the very New York hyper, you know, fashionable style of these girls that she falls in with.
As opposed to Liv, who was always Black Power, post-Black Power movement. Kente cloth.
Yeah.
Well, she's a whole other thing. So yeah, I mean, with what Liv, we really accentuated that Black pride, African heritage, you know, with of patterns, almost just to an extreme and like borderline comedic in a sense. And I guess maybe an audience would be like, why is this so stylized, until we sort of realize the storyline behind that. But you know, I think, and
no,
yes,
the other
okay.
contrast too with the Puritans, right? And forgive me if there's a better word to describe that community, the contrast of how they're dressed. I thought you did a very good job, almost to the point where the scenes where you see them, it almost looks like time travel, like they're in a different dimension or you're looking through a portal. It was so good.
Yeah. I mean, I think we also spent a lot of time sort of analyzing like what the witch would look like, and the resemblance of her hood is sort of that of like a Amish or Puritan sort of. So we wanted them to kind of blend and mold together. And also, we're glad you noticed at the end she grabs her cape. That was
lots of discussion about the cape between us.
Yeah, and it's a disease of what I do. But you also have to know, Mariama, that I love Nathaniel Hawthorne and almost feel guilty about my love for him. So framing with the discussion of the Scarlet Letter, you can't help, right? That's the frame. So I see everything through that. And I'm kind of sick that way. But of course, I think you're right in the movie, and your writing is so brilliant that in some ways Hawthorne tells the truth, right? But do we have the courage to see what it is? So in the way you're retelling that story, and I wanted to ask you about that theme, because the movie starts out and the character says, there's no returning to what came before, right? And that thread is throughout. And then we get to the end, what came before is still here, right? Those beautiful scenes of the paintings, right? And the people, in the sense that the past is now, the present is always the past, things don't change. Can you talk about that maybe in terms of the writing, but also in the production and the design, how that too came together? And to me, that was very moving, especially in the sense of what happens to Jasmine is what happens to the woman in 1968, but metaphorically what happens to women of color. The sense that time has moved, but there's no change. Similar to Nathaniel Hawthorne's grandfather, we're still killing witches in some sense, right? Can you guys talk about that?
Well, Meredith can talk a ton about it, I'm sure, but just to say a little bit, one of the things that, you know, felt meaningful in creating the space of Ancaster, and especially the Master's house, was this idea of all of the almost like sedimentary layers of, you know, the things that had been left behind by previous masters, the way that the space itself could kind of tell the story of the history of the school, and you know, what's been painted over and what remains and what you can see through. And that, I think, was a big part of a lot of the production design. And now I'll throw it over to you, Meredith.
Thank you. Thank you for the setup. Good setup. So, I mean, well, first of all, I have to say that we had sort of a unique situation, which was we started making the film pre-COVID. And so we shot part of it and then continued about a year later. And my art director, Tommy Love, designed when we resumed shooting. So I share ultimately, you know, everything we share. And he, you know, deserves a lot of credit, but also he's a man, so he's not on this panel. But ultimately, I mean, when I read the script initially, I just, to sort of take it back to there for a second, I remember just thinking, wow, there is so much going on in this. And I don't mean just literally in terms of the plot or the story, but thematically. So I think, you know, sort of to echo what both Mariama and Mirren have said in this conversation, something that was so interesting to me in collaborating with Mariama is there's just, you know, so much to work with design wise in terms of the school, the history of the school, like you're talking about the sort of cyclical nature of the horrors that these women are all experiencing. And these three women are experiencing it in different ways and in similar ways at the same time. And then it's also all about representation too, like how they have to represent themselves and present themselves within this framework. And so being able to develop that background for them, I think, to me as a designer, is sort of the most compelling and fulfilling, because you're really like setting up how the actors and how the characters are going to be able to move through space. Like, it's rare that you have a setting that's really sort of driving their motivation in a lot of ways. And then also too, it's so much about economics too, kind of going back to what Mirren is talking about with how we're comparing and contrasting Jasmine to Cressida and to Amelia. It's, you know, you're 18, it's a really big blank slate. And also the same with Gail too, where it's like all of this sort of like structure of the school is thrust upon them, and there's a lot of money behind it, and it's just sort of this really like, honestly, like very cold, ominous thing, I think, even out of the context of a horror movie, to be like thrust into, where Gail is living in this house that has mammy cookie jars, and it just feels like so, you know, cold and not comfortable. And then Jasmine is, you know, thrust into this haunted dorm room, which is, you know, horrifying, whether it's, you know, real or just being hazed at the beginning. And so yeah, I mean, it just, you know, I'm not doing the best job explaining, but it's just, there's so much to unpack with it in terms of the story. But then also, like, what was nice was we had so many different thematic starting points that we could like really get into and just, you know, dig down into. So
I think you did a good job. And I have to say, if it helps, I felt the sense of escape. Like I just wanted them to get out and I wanted myself to get out. Like everything was closing in. And Gail says at one point in the movie, she says, no, it's not ghosts. It's not supernatural. It's America. Right. And there's this notion. So I felt that the design totally had that feeling of cramped in and everyone wants to get out. And of course, I think at the end of the movie, Gail does leave, right? She decides to leave, right? There's this way where we're only here because we are complicit in it. So I felt that came through. I also want to point out, I don't want to decenter the Black female character, the Black woman's experience, but there's a beautiful way where the movie also shows that white women are not safe too, right? And you see that in the design. You see that in the costumes, from the white woman in the hospital to the roommate to the scene in the forest or in the woods with the young girl, and to the kind of very violent scene among the white colleagues, right? And I wanted to talk about that. Was that intentional? How did that affect your writing in the movie? Because that was something I've picked up on. And I think that you can't have the abuse and destruction of women of color without white women also being implicit, but also being unsafe too.
Yeah, I think that that's so well stated. And it's definitely something that, you know, felt very true to me. And it felt like an important aspect of the story also to tell, which is, you know, there's almost this fiction or this misunderstanding that, you know, white supremacy sort of only harms Black people. But I really think that it's bad for everyone. And I think that we see that in the case of Amelia in the film, and there are like other reverberations as well, but that the space of Ancaster is not even uniquely harming Black women, that it's so insidious that all of the characters are being, you know, incredibly harmed by it, and that it's just a powerfully destructive force that will take down everyone. So that it's you know, it was an interesting element to include, because I think that on the one hand, I, you know, got some questions of like, whoa, but I thought that this film was about Black women. And like, so why are we, you know, why do we care about this? But it's like, well, both are true, you know, it's about Black women. And also, you know, I think that this is an important part of the story. And then obviously, like you said, the interplay of that, you know, historical relationship between Black women and white women, and the ways that, you know, we have both been victims of, you know, like the patriarchal system, but then also Black women have been victims of white women and white. So it's all tangled, you know, and I don't think that it's really possible to pull out one thread and say like, this is, you know, this is the thing, this is what matters. It's kind of like, it's all mixed in together.
Well, you make it seem like the water that we swim in. And I would say creatively, one of the most violent moments in the film, 2 times, is at the party where the white students are rapping and using racial slurs. And then that music comes up again. And when the faculty are meeting at their party at the end of the movie. And this notion that I think that you do a really good job of showing how insidious and pervasive it is, even in the most innocent moments where you think racism isn't there, you put it there. And I just felt sorry for myself, but for any person of color who are in those situations, it's like a million little cuts over time that you don't realize that you've been cut to death until you're dead, like it's too late. And so I want to say to you, and I know I want to apologize, you've probably been asked this question a million times. Was it hard for you to have her commit suicide? And I hate to be nerdy with you, but I think what you did was brilliant, and it goes along with the history of African-American literature. Octavia Butler's character, Alice in Kindred, also the slave, hangs herself, right? And I wanted, if you're comfortable, to talk about that moment and the courage to show that, especially when you have this fictional movie that is about horror, that is a psychological thriller, but knowing that that's a reality for many women, BIPOC women in our society, to have Jasmine commit suicide, if that's what she did. I still want to leave that point ambiguous. I know that's a lot, but yeah.
No, thank you, first of all. And I love Kindred. So, you know, to even, you know, be sort of just mentioned in the same breath, that book is amazing. And I do think that it was a really hard decision, and it's not something that I took lightly. On the one hand, when I was writing the story, it felt always inevitable. And in being true to that character's journey and the story that I was telling, and sort of, you know, the history that I was digging into, that felt, that felt the most honest. But it was also really hard. And it's also a character that I loved a lot and love a lot. And my producers particularly really loved and really did not want to go down like that. And they were, you know, they made an appeal to me, which I could understand, where they were like, basically they said, this is horrifically depressing. Can we give some amount of relief or hope to the audience? Does it have to go down this way? What if it happened differently? And I took that on, and there were a couple of drafts of the film where she does not die. And I sat with it for, you know, a few weeks. And one night I went to bed and I woke up in the morning and I just felt like I was not being honest or authentic. And I was not telling the story in the way that it was demanding to be told. So I went in and I told them that I had to, you know, reverse that decision. And they were, you know, as they always are, you know, really, you know, understanding, and like, you know, they were like, okay. And it's just a place that I also had to reach to have that certainty, because it's never what you want to do, you know, especially to a young Black woman who's almost like a surrogate for myself, you know, which is even stranger, because it's, you know, you're writing in your own death. But it felt like the painful choice in this instance was also just the honest choice, and it was the right choice. But it's tough because, you know, I feel like Jasmine's life is precious, and but in telling her story and in treating that character with the respect and the nuance and everything that she deserved, I had to go there. But it was hard.
No, thank you. Can you talk then about that scene? And I hate to stay there, but I think that scene too was well done in terms of design and your work. The scene where she's discovered in the room by Gail.
Sorry, was that directed towards me? You cut out in the beginning.
Oh, either Mirren or Meredith to talk about your work in crafting that scene where Gail does discover Jasmine's body, how that was done. And I do think it was done respectfully, although it was still done, right?
Yeah, it's tricky because, and also, again, this is something that Mariama and I talked about a lot, like theoretically, and then this was something that Tommy also ended up carrying out in terms of the build of the dorm room. That was the one set that was a full build. So I mean, a lot was planned out in terms of like the shape of the dorm itself, like again, to go back to sort of the oppressiveness of the room, the sort of bigger you know, it being a microcosm for the whole university. Even like sort of very subtle things like Jasmine's side of the room is like worse than Amelia's in terms of like how the roof relates to it. But I mean, it's obviously a very powerful scene. It's like tricky because I think, you know, and I don't want to speak for Mariama, I think it's tricky because you need it to be impactful to a certain degree, and you need to explain it in really honest terms. But it's also this thing that like can't be sensational, and I think that it comes across really well and rides that line really well. And I think that, you know, Tommy's design of the dorm room really carries that out well and feels planned out and conducive to that.
I also think, you know, not revealing her entire body, but there's like a sort of sadness to her like feet dangling and Gail, you know, clenching onto them. And I'm blanking on whether the hanging witch made the cut, but did she?
Well, there are several foreshadowing moments where you see the
Yeah.
shadow from outside, right? She's walking. Yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, I also had a really, you know, a bit of a, you know, a relation to that as well. And
the other thing, Mirren, in your area that I feel like makes the moment that much more sort of tender and painful are like all of the details of like, you know, like her jeans, like, you know, what was she wearing on that day, her bare feet and her nail polish, and it's a little chipped nail polish, and all of the, you know, humanity of that character and that person, I think comes across in that moment in a way that's you know, very, you know, it's excruciating, but it also feels true.
yeah, definitely. I think you're muted. You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. I think that moment is where we see Gail's humanity too. Unfortunately, right? The irony is that in Jasmine's death, Gail becomes a human being or more human alive. But I like the scene in its mutedness. And so when I say respectful, there's an observance where I feel like as the viewer, Jasmine was already dead. The hanging was just kind of a last act, right, of what happens to her because of the other microaggressions or hits that she takes. So yes, it really forced me to think, which is why I think the direction and the writing was so brilliant. It was unexpected. And it also caused me to slow down. I want to talk about the sense of, if you're comfortable, talking about where do you go from here? What did you learn from doing this work that you think might influence your future storytelling or future projects that you might have?
Well, one thing that I would love to do, or at least consider for my next film, is to, you know, provide some measure of hope. Definitely don't always want to, you know, leave people feeling like, you know, things are doomed. But, you know, on a slightly more serious note, I do think that, you know, the process of creating the film was the most, you know, intense education I've ever had. And in terms of storytelling and also collaboration and just like the practicals of how to help run a set. There are a lot of lessons that I want to take into the next project and then just keep going. You know, I think that one of the most important things that I also realized is that you just have to do it. You know, you have to create and you have to just keep on putting yourself out there.
And when you talk about creating, putting yourself out there, like many writers or artists, do you think it's natural to go to the autobiography first? So do you feel like you're done with PWIs or telling that story?
Yeah, you know, in some respects, I kind of yes, I think so. I think that like in terms of it's funny how this happened because I was in this process of writing a lot of scripts when I was you know, at a certain age, and Master was the most recent one that I had written right before my short film Hair Wolf went to Sundance, and then a lot of doors started opening for me. And it's also the script that I feel closest to, so it's very fortunate that it worked out that way. But it was almost a little bit of a surprise to me, and it wasn't entirely intentional, how personal a project it was and how much sort of vulnerability and self-exposure it demanded. And it feels very appropriate for it to be a first film, because it's really kind of like, you know, cutting out a part of myself and, you know, saying, here I am and here's what I'm doing. But I think that I am excited and eager to, you know, move in a bunch of different spaces. And I don't want to be, you know, sort of like the, you know, the like PWI woman here to like, you know, tell people what's what. I definitely want to, you know, open it up to all sorts of different, you know, creative expressions. But it's really, really meaningful to me. I think that this was the film that I got to start with, because it's truly, I couldn't get much more personal than this.
And Meredith and Mirren, are you both comfortable talking about maybe what you learned from this experience and the projects that you're working on moving forward?
Yeah. I guess I'll go first this time, Mirren. Yeah, I mean, I kind of just want to go back quickly to what Mariama said about like learning lessons sort of through the process of making the film, because I also think like something that I really admired working with Mariama is that she's like incredibly flexible. And I don't mean that in the sense where she's like gonna compromise with the integrity of the film, but just there were like really immense challenges on this project. Even in the first part before COVID was even an entity. And every time there was an extreme challenge, Mariama was just like really, you know, stepped up to the plate, was like cool as a cucumber, like very good creative problem solver. And so I think that goes a long way when you're a department head or a creative collaborator, where it allows you to also think on your feet and like come up with creative solutions, and you're not, you know, sort of just like in the gutter, losing it. Not that like it's all or nothing, but I just think that that's, you know, very motivating. And yeah, I just want to echo that. I think like every project is like a really great learning experience. It's also really fun to go into a project being like, I don't really know very much about this world at all. I know just kind of what I've read about, and I really want to get into like what motivates these characters. I like want to become an expert on these spaces. I really just want to dig into that. So I think for me, getting to do that like with a whole new set of sets and issues and problems is the sort of the most compelling and fulfilling.
Thank you, Mirren.
Yeah, I mean, I think once again it was very challenging in the sense, well, I was pregnant and then we stopped in the pandemic. I had a baby and then we came back and I had already had like a 1-year-old. So sort of surreal in that sense. But having that time off also kind of allowed me to think a little bit more about the characters as well. And Mariama is just has such a strong visual eye, which is, you know, of course, the dream for costume designer, because she really understands color and character, and she gets things, and she gets fashion, most importantly. So, you know, throwing something ridiculous on like Cressida, like a pair of metallic pants, didn't really faze her where it might scare somebody else. You know, I think we were able to sort of really do a heightened version of the characters without it being superfluous, silly, and unrealistic. So finding that balance, I think, was really, you know, rewarding as well. And I do think researching Liv and sort of the Amish side to her, or, you know, that sort of culture perhaps where she's from, and someone who's so completely confused and also lying, and, you know, all that. It was just such an interesting character study for me. And yeah, I really appreciated all like the flawless casting as well, because you know it obviously makes my job easier when the actor suits the character. So yeah, moving forward, I think I learned a lot about visuals, especially. I've never done this genre before, so having pops of color and obviously red is such a classic sort of horror film color, but it really does help tell a story. So sometimes I think it's okay to do the thing we've seen before in that respect. So
Well, thank you. I want to thank you all for taking the time to have a conversation with me today. And I just want you to know how much of an honor it was. And I just want to say congratulations on the film. And I'm excited to see what you're going to do next, and just wishing you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. Thanks,
so
Meredith.
cool.
Thanks, Mirren.
thank you.